Okay, and so we've been talking about the restrictions on the input of we the people in the system of the US Constitution. But we also want to point out that it is a dilemma and a challenge and a struggle because despite those significant restrictions on we the people, and we need to be clear about that, the Constitution does have some important democratic or at least Republican, not in terms of the Republican Party, but in terms of representative democracy, in terms of having some input by we the people or some concern about the welfare of the people. And so it's important to recognize that there is that balance that was achieved. Whether it's a perfect balance is up for debate, it's a struggle to maintain that balance, etc. But there are ways in which, despite those significant restrictions on we the people, the Constitution does have some important democratic or Republican components. So the first thing is we have that the preamble to the US Constitution points out in its phrasing that the very first part of the US Constitution is called the preamble. It lays out the principles of what the document is meant to do, and it argues that we the people do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. It is we the people who have created it, unlike a system of the divine right of kings where God chooses the king then makes the decisions about what the government is going to do and what in that society are going to have. Instead, it is a very different system where the authority of this system of government comes from we the people. It was a choice that we made in agreeing to the Constitution of the United States of America, and it's an ongoing agreement that we have that we live under this. Um, and so uh, that's one indication that we the people mattered. Another one is this idea that I've already talked about is that there is certainly a lot more citizen input than we had under British rule. The system we had under British King and the Parliament um, led very little input from we the people, particularly in the colonies. We did not have any seats in the British House of Commons. We had no say over what Parliament did. We didn't have any influence over the King. And so, in that sense, we have a lot more input than we had historically under British rule. But then we also have that in terms of many of the different government systems at that time, the divine right of kings, that system, we have certainly a lot more input. There were ways in which we the people mattered. We had, as we're going to talk about, input in terms of the House of Representatives. We had some indirect input electoral in the United States. It is based on votes by people. And so, in that sense, there is input by we the people that doesn't exist in a system of divine right of kings or the system that we had under the British government. Another one, and perhaps one of the most important ones, is that the Bill of Rights is put into the US Constitution to protect individual rights. That it is a description of important liberties that we, the people, have, and according to the Declaration of Independence, we've always had those because they're our natural rights. But then it's going to say that the national government cannot pass laws that restrict freedom of speech, religion, press, petition, assembly. They can't impose cruel and unusual punishment. They cannot use illegal search and seizure. But, as the Third Amendment says, they can't put soldiers into your house during peacetime. All of those things are restrictions on the national government, and they are meant to protect individual liberties, liberties of we the people. Regardless of whether you owned land or not, you had those protections. So that's an important component. And it's important to say, as we've talked about, is that the framers did not originally include that. It was part of the deal. The states demanded it as saying we will only ratify the Constitution if there is a Bill of Rights. And so we include that and should include that because it was an important negotiating strategy that led to the Bill of Rights. But the Bill of Rights, once part of the US Constitution, is an important indication that we the people mattered and that this system of government was meant to protect individual liberties. And then we have the more complicated one to describe is that we had just talked about the idea that only one half of one branch of government was chosen by we the people. But if you change the emphasis slightly, that becomes an important observation. It is one half of arguably the most important branch, the legislative branch, legislative supremacy, is chosen by we the people. So all acts of Congress must be passed by the House of Representatives. The People's House must sign off on whatever ideas. The US Senate cannot just put things through on its own. It needs support from the US House of Representatives, and the US House of Representatives are to represent the views of the people. And so, in that sense, you have, if you just change that emphasis, you can take a look at the same structure that we have, but it's an indication that the framers did have some concern. The other thing is that all revenue bills, all bills dealing with spending taxpayer money, must originate in the House of Representatives. That was put in as an indication, yet again, that the framers thought that the people did need to have some say over decisions that were made by the national government. We can see that despite some important limitations, there are ways in which we the people mattered to the framers of the US Constitution. So moving on, we also want to talk about another way in which we the people mattered. It's one that isn't directly related to the framers because it's over time, but one thing we can recognize is that even though the Constitution is very hard to amend, and we've been saying that time and again, it takes 2/3 to propose, 3/4 to ratify, it clearly is a difficult thing to do. That although the Constitution is very hard to amend, it is still possible to do. So first of all, that's better than the Articles of Confederation, which required unanimity in order to change, and so that wasn't possible. But at the same time, we also can take a look at what sort of amendments have actually made it through. We get the changes that have been made over time and point out that some of those have been ones to increase the role of citizen input. So if you take a look at the 15th Amendment that was ratified in 1870, that African American men were granted the right to vote. And so that expands the franchise, expands the number of people who could vote. Although, as we talk about, and we'll continue to talk about when we talk about civil rights, there are ways in which that was undermined significantly throughout the United States. But in the Constitution, the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870 increased the input to allow African American men the right to vote. The 17th Amendment in 1913 created the direct election of U.S. senators. We talked about that. The original plan in the U.S. Constitution was to have the state legislatures decide who the U.S. senators were, but that changed in 1913 with the 17th Amendment when that was ratified. Now the senators had to kiss babies and go talk to people and drink bad coffee and go on the campaign trail to get we the people to vote for them. And that was something they didn't have to do prior to 1913 because it was the state legislatures, and they could just go grab a whiskey and go into a back room and make sure that the state legislators continue to vote for them. The 19th Amendment in 1920 gave women the right to vote, and then the 26th Amendment in 1971 dropped the voting age from 21 to 18. And we saw a number of these things in the history of voting rights in Chapter 1. And so it kind of links to that. And so what we can see is that despite the difficulty of amending the U.S. Constitution, the changes that we've seen over time have generally been ones to expand the number of people who can participate, or in the instance of the 17th Amendment, allow us to have more of a say. So now it is the case that one of three branches is chosen by we the people. The House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate are chosen by the votes of we the people. And then we have the executive branch is still chosen by the Electoral College. The judicial branch is chosen by the President of the United States, confirmed by a majority, and then they serve for life. But the changes over time have increased citizen input. So the final thing I want to do is just to give an overview relatively quickly, because I think the overall assessment is not that easy to do, and it may not necessarily be the most important thing, but it's worth thinking about because there's certainly politicians who make this argument. And some argue, you hear that it is a perfect balance. It is powerful but not too powerful. So it increased from the Articles of Confederation so that now, but at the same time, the government officials can't abuse their power. You can point to the idea that it's long-lasting but able to change with the times, because we do have an 18th century document that is still working for us today in the 21st century. The problem with these viewpoints is that it doesn't talk about, and the textbook points out, it's a struggle for democracy, but it also forgets something, and that is that the document was built on slavery. As we've talked about again before, but you cannot say it enough, is that slavery was allowed. The Three-Fifths Compromise allowed slavery to exist. It was a compromise that people were willing to make because they felt it was important to hold together the entire United States instead of splitting into two countries, and the South might have been taken over by the British influence or by the British government again, a whole complicated thing. And so there might be reasons why they justified this and said it was worth doing, but slavery was put into the U.S. Constitution. It is part of that history. And because of that, and because the decision rules were put into place that made it difficult, in fact impossible, for the Constitution to come up with a peaceful solution to slavery, we had to have a civil war in order to solve that issue. And civil war is not allowed in the U.S. Constitution. The other thing that it misses is the idea, it implies that the difficulty of amending the U.S. Constitution is a substantive one. It's because it's right, because it's good, because it's endowed by their creator to understand how people work, and they came up with a perfect system, an almost religiously influenced and a document that should be revered. The problem with that interpretation is it forgets the procedural elements. The reason why it hasn't been amended very often is because it's so hard to do procedurally. To get 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of the states to propose is possible but difficult. And very difficult is get 3/4 of the states to ratify any amendment to the US Constitution. So in that sense, it's really a procedural argument that people have turned into a substantive argument in saying that there is some normative reason why this is. Okay? But one thing that does seem to be pretty clear is that we do have an 18th century document for a 21st century world. And that leads to some questions. Why can't we, the people, elect the president? Thought that we shouldn't. They put that into place, and the document is really hard to change. And so now we have it that we don't directly elect the president of the United States. They also put into place that judges never face the voters. They're appointed by the president, confirmed by the US Senate, and they're there for life. That's another example. Whether or not you should have elected judges or not is an open debate. It doesn't mean that we necessarily do need to change it. It also, another example that's often used that resonates here in California is that why does North Dakota, with a population of 577,000, just a few more thousand than the population of Long Beach, they have 2 senators, in California with a population of almost 40 million. And so that is something that is built into the Constitution. If you want to change that, and California would like to change that, but North Dakota wouldn't, you'd have to amend the Constitution. And there are enough smaller states like North Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota, Idaho, places like that, who would lose considerable amount of representation if you switch to having the US Senate chosen the size of your Senate delegation based on your population. Those states wouldn't agree to that change because they need to agree to that change. 3/4 of the states need to do that to change it. And so it's hard. There's no way of necessarily coming up with a Connecticut compromise. It's difficult to do. It's not impossible. The Constitution can be amended, but at the same time, it's very difficult to do. And so what we do have is an 18th century document that is now meant to work in the 21st century world. And thinking through whether or not we should change those things, and then also being realistic about how possible